go now to our second word. From time, we move to the word life. Life. All right, let's talk about the nature of life. And here's reason number 2. Life comes from life, comes from life, comes from life, comes from life. You get the idea. Living things come from living things. Right? One of my favorite things, we don't say this in America. I'm from America, as you know, probably can detect by my accent. One of my favorite things that you Australians say is, you will say that somebody fell pregnant. We don't say that in America. We say you got pregnant, right? I got pregnant or whatever. But I love it. I remember the first time I heard it, I fell pregnant. I was like, you fell pregnant? What does falling have to do with this, right? Unless it's falling on a bed, right? It's like, I fell pregnant. I fell over and I woke up and I was, no. Okay, listen. The idea of falling pregnant is something that we all it's just so routine. It's so obvious that it hardly requires stating. Babies come from moms, right? Life comes from living things. Right? Babies don't come from storks, and even if they did, storks are also alive, right? So it's this idea that babies come from living things, or living things come from living things. I'm getting my analogies mixed up here. So John chapter 1, we go from the first book of the New Testament, Genesis chapter 1, to now one of the Gospels, one of the first 4 books of the New Testament. We go from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And the first 4 books of the New Testament are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We find ourselves in the Gospel of John, and we find these words which are absolutely reminiscent. They echo what we were just reading moments ago in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice this, John chapter 1, verses 1 and 3. In the beginning was the Word. The Greek word here is the word logos. We'll come back to that in just a second. In the beginning was the Word, and through Him, which is fascinating, attributing personality to a word. In the beginning was the Word, the logos, and all things were made by Him. The Word is a him. The Word is a he. The Word is a person. Now that word logos is an important word. It's the same root. It's the root that we get words like biology from. So biology is 2 words, bios, which is life, and logos. The word about life, or geology, geo, which is earth, and logos, which is the word. So geology is the word about the earth. Anthropology, the word about the study of mankind. Paleontology, the word about fossils. Right? And so the word logos is fascinating because here in John chapter 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word wasn't an it, the Word was a he and a him. The Word was a person. A living person. Life comes from life. The man on the screen that you see there is a man by the name of Antony Flew. Antony Flew was arguably the world's foremost academic atheist until 2007. He died not many years after that in 2010. But he was a published and vociferous and absolutely adamant academic atheist taught at many of the most premier universities in England, right? Antony Flew. And a fascinating thing happened. There was a scandal that took place in the philosophical community of England in 2005 and 6 and 7 when Flew actually changed his mind. He came out and he said, you know what? I've been looking at the evidence. I've been reconsidering my former position. And I mentioned a moment ago that academics don't like to change their perspective. When they've stated something and they've put it in writing and it's been peer reviewed and they're on record, they only very reluctantly yield to the evidence. Like all of us, by the way, academics are no different from us in that regard, right? If we've really put our foot down, we don't like to back off. We don't like to be wrong. It's not easy to say I was wrong. And it's really not easy to say if you've dedicated your academic life and career to the promulgation of the idea, in part, that there is no God. Most of Flew's studies were in the philosophy of religion. And he regarded the belief in the existence of God as a kind of absurdity, and he published academic papers about it. He was kind of the Richard Dawkins of his day, if you know who Richard Dawkins is. Dawkins is one of the foremost popular atheists of the day. And yet, in 2007, this book was published, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Which raises the question, how do you get an intellectual, academic, committed atheist to change his mind from a position that he has held for decades to a new position? Well, let's ask him. You can read the book. The book is fascinating, by the way, but let me just give you part of what's in the book. Flew said this: what I think the DNA, right? DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acid molecule. He says, what I think the DNA material has done is shown that, watch this now, that intelligence must have been involved in getting all these extraordinarily diverse elements together. The enormous complexity by which the results were achieved looked to me like the work of, what's that word? Intelligence. It's fascinating. He says something about DNA. Now, I'm sure that, I don't know how long ago it was that you were in a class where you had to study DNA and the nucleotides and RNA and all of this. I don't know how long ago that was for you, but you almost certainly remember that the thing that most of us recall about DNA is that it's kind of this like spiral staircase, right? It's like a spiral staircase with these nucleotide stairs that go across between two strands. The fascinating thing about DNA, though, is not its chassis. It's not its structure. What made DNA so amazing, and what Flew is saying here, is it wasn't the double helix structure that caused me to reconsider my perspective. It was that structure contained a code. Contained a what word did I say, everyone? That structure contained a code. There was a language in there. There was data in there. There was information in there. Now watch this. Francis Crick, who was one of the co-discoverers of the DNA molecule, right, with James Watson in like 1962, one of the co-discoverers of the DNA molecule, notice what he himself said. I mean, after this discovery was found, because people knew, right? People knew well before 1962 that they'd say, oh, you're a chip off the old block. You look just like your mother. You look just like your father. Oh, you look just like your granddad as a baby. People understood what's called heritability. They knew that you could look like your mom, or you could look like your dad, or you could look like your granddad, but the mechanism of heritability was not known. Everybody knew information was being passed on, but how is that information being passed on, and where does the information come from, right? And the discovery of DNA was, hey, this is the chassis, this is the black box that holds the code, holds the language. And so notice what Crick says. Crick, who, again, was one of the co-discoverers, he received the Nobel Prize in 1962 for this discovery. Notice what he says. An honest man or woman, armed with all of the knowledge available to us, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a, what's that word? It's a miracle. He's like, an honest person, looking at the data that we now have, would have to say it looks basically miraculous. He continues, so many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. To get what going? To get life going. To get this whole thing, babies coming from mothers, to get that whole process going, right? In its, very early unicellular state. But you just fast forward. You fast forward the tape. And we say, well, where do babies come from? Babies come from moms. Okay, true enough, and it's something that is so obvious that it scarcely needs stating, but the point is that where did this get started? Where did the information come from? Where did the data come from? And Crick's like, look, straight up, an honest guy who, by the way, himself was an atheist, not a believer, not a follower of God, not somebody that, was a Bible believer of any stripe. He later would actually propose a fascinating theory that came to be called directed panspermia. Directed panspermia. Now that sounds really fancy. It sounds really kind of almost persuasive when you say it that way, directed. Well, directed means that it was purposeful, that it was done with intentionality. Directed panspermia, root word sperm, from the word seed. And basically it's the idea, I know it's going to sound crazy, but the idea is that the DNA molecule was placed on spaceships by aliens long ways away, a long time ago, and they launched these spaceships out just into the universe, and luckily for us, one of those spaceships with the DNA molecule landed on our planet. I'm telling you. And you have to actually admire the intellectual honesty here. Because if you were walking through the woods and you saw an iPhone, right? If you saw an iPhone, you would immediately intuit, even if you were back in, the 1800s or the 1900s, you would look and you would say, this is the work of intelligence. That you would understand that you were looking at something that contains information and that required intelligence to make. right? And so when Flew and when Crick and when other molecular biologists and scientists saw DNA, they scratched their head and they said, some intelligent source created this. Now, Flew said, I think it's a designer. I think it's some sort of a deity, some sort of a god. Crick said, I think it's some sort of alien intelligence. But the point is, I mean, there could be no greater alien intelligence than God himself, right? God is alien to the world. Of course, he became one of us. We'll talk about that later. But the idea that it was some extraterrestrial, which just means not from this earth intelligence, is actually totally consistent with what Scripture says when it says, in the beginning was the Word, and through him all things were made. There was an intelligent source, a super intelligent source, not from this planet, that caused DNA to come here and to replicate. I agree. I agree. Now, the fascinating thing is that Flew and Crick talk about conditions, the conditions being just right for the promulgation of DNA in the biological realm. The problem is it's not just about conditions, it's about information. It's about what word, everyone? Information is crucial, and listen to me very carefully here. The only known source of information is intelligence. Information comes from intelligent sources, right? Go back to the iPhone or to a computer. We just mentioned this a moment ago. An iPhone is really made up of two parts. It has its chassis, or its outside, the screen and the metal and the silicon. That's what it's made of, right? But an iPhone without computer programming, without an operating system is basically useless. Without a computer without an operating system is essentially useless. In fact, there's actually a term for this in the computer programming world, and it's GIGO. And you ever heard that term before? GIGO? It stands for garbage in, garbage out. And what it means is, if you're a garbage programmer and you put garbage programs or garbage apps, and then you write a bad program with bad code and you put it into the chassis, whether it's an iPad or an iPhone or a computer, you're not going to get a really great usable interface out. If you have bad programming in, you'll have bad user experience on the way out. Because we understand that in order to get information out of that chassis, you have to have an intelligent source that put it in. And when Crick and Watson discovered DNA, they're like, man, there's language there, there's information there. Take, for example, the word cow. Now, you and I, English-speaking people, English-reading people, we look up at that, and that transaction happens so quickly in your mind, you go from seeing a series of symbols, in this case, 3 symbols, in sequence. You go from seeing that, you instantaneously get the picture in your head. It happens in nanoseconds. Right? In fact, it happens so naturally, so easily, and so seamlessly that it's not even possible for you to look at that word and not read it. Once you have the ability to read, you can't not read, right? It's very difficult to read. Now, if I put this word up, you can read it, you can sound it out, but you don't know probably what that word is. Well, that is the same word that we just had a moment ago, but in Indonesian, right? So you have the word cow, and that C, that O, that W are symbols that point to an actual beast, an animal that lives in, the pasture and moose, right? But of course, that word there, sapi, the Indonesian word, that's not a cow itself. It's a symbol. But you and I understand that we have put information, we have put data into those symbols. You were told as a little boy, that's a cow. Cows go moo. You were told as a little girl, that's a horse. Horses whinny. That's a dog. Dogs bark. That's a cat. Cats meow. That symbol, and then you later learned k and d and ah and g. You learned these sounds, and now you just so easily, so seamlessly transition from symbols to reality. It's easy breezy. Right? But information has been put into those symbols. For example, for some of you, probably for many of you in this room, these symbols make sense. You would look at that and you would say, yeah, I know what that is. That's a treble clef, that's an 8th note, and that's an A. Right? But some of you who can't read music, you know that it means something. You can tell it was put there with intentionality and with purpose, but you don't know it because you don't read the code. You don't read the data. What Crick and what Watson discovered was like this. It was like the word sapi, or like the word cow, or how about this one? Not just music, but this. Right? Now, this means something. It might not mean something to anyone in this room. Can anyone in here read this? This is the Chinese character for the word life. life. John chapter 1 verse 4 says, in him was life. Now watch this, several references here. John chapter 14 verse 6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus speaking to a woman named Martha just before the resurrection of her brother Lazarus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, yet he shall live. I am the life. I contain the life, the logos, the word, the data, the information, the code. Anthony Flew said, man, there's data in DNA. And he changed his mind. After decades of committed intellectual academic atheism, he said, somebody has put a fly in the ointment. Somebody has put some data into this thing. We found a biological iPhone with an operating system that works really, really well. It didn't just happen, said Flew. In fact, credit to Flew. He was a true evidentialist. He was somebody that said, I will follow the conclusion wherever the evidence leads. A lot of people are not evidentialists, they're idealists. And they are not just idealists, they're so committed to their ideology that they don't care what the evidence says, they'll remain committed to their ideology. So credit to Flew, who even after decades of professional and academic commitment to atheism said, you know what, I was wrong. The evidence now strongly suggests that there is data there is information there. And the Bible says that information came from God himself, from the Word, from the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, through him all things were made. And so not only did the universe and time itself had a beginning, but life had a beginning, and that beginning was alive. Because God is eternally existent. He is eternally alive. So living things come from living things, come from living things, come from living things.